The Pumpkin in the Parish Graveyard. Inspector Purbright. BBC Horror Mystery. The morning began with fog, the soft, milky sort that clings to gravestones as though uncertain whether to depart. From St. Botolph's Tower came the usual peal for matins, though muted by the mist. The churchyard, in its dim, respectful quiet, was accustomed to solitude. It did not expect company so early. Mr. Hodge, the verger, arrived with his usual assortment of grievances and keys. He disliked fog because it made the stones slick, and disliked autumn because it made the vicar sentimental. But he stopped short halfway down the central path. Upon the grave of Edith Cramley, a modest slate slab near the yew, sat a pumpkin. It was large, clean, and oddly luminous against the grey. Its face, carved with care, wore a grin too precise to be cheerful. The candle within had burned low, leaving the faint smell of tallow and something sweetly rotten. Mr. Hodge, a man with little taste for the theatrical, regarded it as an invasion. "Disgraceful," he murmured. He looked around, though no one was there to agree. The grave itself, however, seemed freshly attended, the edges swept, the grass pressed flat as though by kneeling. He frowned, locked the vestry door behind him, and went to find the vicar. By 9 o'clock the matter had passed through 3 pairs of hands and 1 telephone line to the police. The town clerk, pressed for comment, described it as a minor nuisance, though in poor taste. Mrs. Hodge told the milkman that it was devil worship, or near enough. Within the hour, the pumpkin was discussed in the drapery, the post office, and the tea-room, by which time its grin had grown in imagination to something sinister and supernatural. Inspector Purbright heard of it, not through official channels but through Miss Teatime, who had stopped by the station to collect a parcel. "A pumpkin," she said with a delicate shudder. "On a grave of all places." Some people have a queer idea of remembrance. Purbright, who had been examining the week's reports of bicycle thefts, looked up with mild interest. "Which grave was it, did she say?" "Edith Cramley, apparently." "One of those names that feels unfinished, don't you think?" He smiled. "Or rather, unremembered." By midday, Purbright and Sergeant Love were walking through the fog toward St. Botolph's. Love, bundled in his overcoat, seemed personally affronted by the weather. "You don't think it's some of them university lads, sir?" "They're fond of mischief this time of year." "Possibly," said Purbright, "though their mischief rarely includes polishing headstones." The pumpkin remained as found. Its candle had guttered out, leaving only the faintest thread of smoke curling through the lid. Purbright knelt, inspected the damp earth, and traced a finger along the indentations left by the object's weight. The ground beneath seemed slightly uneven. "Not dug up, sir?" Love ventured. "No, disturbed perhaps, but not opened. See here, the moss along the edge is torn in a line as though brushed by cloth. Someone knelt here or leaned." Love exhaled steam. "Suppose they were paying respects, then left that thing behind?" "Perhaps," said Purbright quietly. "Or perhaps they wished the rest of us to notice their respects." The vicar arrived, apologetic and flustered. "A dreadful business, Inspector. We've never had such goings-on. The lady's been at rest for half a century, poor soul. Do you recall her?" "Vaguely. Drowned, I believe, during the war years. Her fiancé went to France and never returned. There was talk of melancholy, though one mustn't pry." Purbright straightened, brushing soil from his hand. "No, one mustn't. But sometimes, Vicar, melancholy pries of its own accord." He requested the pumpkin remain untouched for the moment. The vicar hesitated but consented. As they left the churchyard, the fog began to thin, and a slant of weak sunlight fell across the grave. The carved face caught it briefly and for a moment seemed almost alive, not grinning, but waiting. "Odd," murmured Love. "If it's a joke, it's not a funny one." Purbright glanced back once more. "Few jokes are, Sergeant, when told to the dead." He said nothing more until they reached the gate, but as he lit his pipe, His expression held that faint, inward amusement peculiar to him, the look of a man who had already begun, gently, to wonder why. By the time the church bell marked 11, the fog had begun to lift from Flaxborough High Street, revealing its familiar geometry of neat windows and self-respecting shop fronts. The air held that damp sweetness peculiar to autumn. Fallen leaves, polish, and faint coal smoke, all faintly disturbed by the tremor of something to talk about. Word of the pumpkin. Having drifted from pew to counter was now a matter of public conscience. In Mrs. Garbutt's haberdashery, 2 customers leaned conspiratorially over the ribbons, each lowering her voice while ensuring it carried just far enough. One declared it the work of youths with no moral direction. The other suspected something foreign. Mrs. Garbutt herself, being a woman of balance, observed that in her day such things were done by gypsies for luck, not for mischief. The butcher, meanwhile, reported to a customer that it was a witch's mark, which, once filtered through the ear of the barber, became a memorial charm. By luncheon, the pumpkin had gathered more interpretations than the Book of Revelation and a more devoted readership. At 12:30, Miss Lucilla Teatime arranged her hat with the precise tilt of a woman setting a social trap. She had no personal interest in pumpkins, but an abiding passion for the motives that grew beneath them. Carrying a parcel under one arm and curiosity under the other, she drifted toward the tea shop near the market, where conversation simmered more effectively than any kettle. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of scones and speculation. Miss Teatime's entrance quieted the room by half a decibel, enough to mark her authority. She took her place by the window where gossip, like pollen, floated freely between tables. "Such a frightful thing," sighed Mrs. Digby from behind her teacup. "The churchyard, of all places," Miss Teatime smiled, stirring her tea with idle grace. "Oh, I shouldn't think frightful, dear. Rather touching. Someone remembering what the rest of us have forgotten." "You mean to say it was meant kindly?" "I rarely presume kindness," said Miss Teatime softly, "but I believe in gestures, and that pumpkin was very deliberate." From the corner, the editor of the Flaxborough Citizen, Mr. Povey, sat pretending to read proofs. He wasn't. His newspaper had not enjoyed such a windfall of public interest in weeks. Still, he understood that certain subjects required restraint. An unnamed source had already phoned to warn that no publicity would be in good taste. He made a note to prepare a short, sober piece. "Parish incident causes mild concern." The headline, like its readers, would say much while revealing nothing. By mid-afternoon, the matter had reached the precincts of the police station once more. Sergeant Love, returning from his errand, brought in a folded sheet of paper and a face divided between amusement and doubt. "A statement from the verger, sir," he announced. "He's written that he saw footprints by the grave, small ones. Lady's size by the look." Purbright read the note without comment. The office smelled of old files and damp wool, a kind of bureaucratic comfort. Outside, the faint toll of the church clock echoed through the fog. "Interesting," he murmured, lighting his pipe. "Mr. Hodge is not a fanciful man." "No, sir." "Think it means anything?" "It means," Purbright said, glancing through the window toward the pale outline of the church tower, "that whoever placed the pumpkin wished to be noticed, but not identified. And perhaps, Sergeant, that she succeeded." Love frowned. "She, sir?" "A guess only. Small steps, the care in the carving, and the sentiment. Men rarely remember the dead unless there's inheritance involved." Love allowed himself a smile. "Could have been one of them ghost story types, sir." "It's near Halloween." "Quite so," Purbright replied, "though ghosts, in my experience, seldom choose seasonal decor." The door opened to reveal Miss Teatime, bright and composed as a cat in borrowed sunshine. "Inspector," she began with courteous urgency, "I wouldn't dream of intruding, but I thought you'd wish to know. The widow Cramley has taken to her bed." Purbright gestured to a chair. Illness? Distress, they say. Poor soul. She read about the pumpkin in the grocer's queue and went quite pale. Some recalled she used to visit that grave years ago, though she denies it now. He regarded her thoughtfully.
And how did you come by this information?
Miss Teatime smiled faintly. By standing where people speak too freely, Purbright inclined his head in gratitude. A most useful position. When she had gone, Love looked uneasy.
If she's ill, sir, we shouldn't trouble her, should we?
On the contrary, said Purbright, we must. People who deny too much often have something to remember. Besides, he reached for his coat, I found the best medicine for secrecy is polite conversation. The two men left the station and walked once more toward the church, their footsteps clicking against the cobbles. The fog, though thinner now, still lingered in the lanes, softening edges and muting sound. From somewhere beyond the rooftops came the low call of a train, mournful and brief, like a sigh through iron. As they passed the greengrocer's window, Love nodded toward a small display of pumpkins stacked beside the onions. "Whole lot of them about this year," he said. Purbright paused, studying the orange shapes under the flickering gaslight. "Yes, harvest symbols, I believe. Prosperity, fecundity, remembrance, depending on the interpreter." "Or pranks, sir?" "Or confessions," Purbright added quietly. "That's the trouble with symbols, Sergeant. They rarely mean just one thing." They continued in silence until the square opened before them, the tower of St. Botolph's rising from mist like a patient sentinel. Purbright glanced toward the churchyard gate, now chained against intrusion. Beyond it, the grave lay unseen but unforgotten, its guardian grin fading in the dimness. He drew a slow breath, the chill air coiling through his pipe smoke. "Well, Sergeant," he said, half to himself, "let us see whether memory can keep a secret better than stone." The bell struck the quarter, and their footsteps carried softly away into the echo. The gate to St. Botolph's churchyard gave a reluctant creak as Purbright pushed it open, the hinges protesting against the damp. A faint drizzle had begun, fine enough to bead upon his coat, but heavy enough to deepen the scent of moss and stone. Sergeant Love followed, collar up, eyes darting toward the shadows between the graves. The fog of the morning had thinned into a low, colourless light that made every shape seem half-formed, as if the churchyard itself were hesitating to reveal what it knew. The grave of Edith Cramley lay near the old yew, just where it had before, and still carried the faint impression where the pumpkin had rested. The vicar, anxious for decency, had ordered it removed at dawn, leaving only a pale ring in the grass and a darker smudge in the earth where the candle had dripped. Purbright knelt, the moisture gathering on the brim of his hat and slipping down like slow punctuation. He ran a gloved finger along the edge of the slab. "Not new earth," he murmured.
"See the colour?"
"It's compacted, old soil, disturbed but not lifted." Love crouched beside him. "Could be an animal, sir. Badgers root about this time of year." "Badgers don't carve pumpkins, Sergeant." A faint smile ghosted across Purbright's face before he straightened, brushing his knees. He studied the lettering on the stone. Edith Cramley, 1894-1915, peace is hers. The inscription was shallow from years of weather, yet the name still caught what little light there was. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. 1915? The war year. Drowned, according to the vicar. Yes, sir.
"Tragic," he said. "Tragic," Purbright repeated, "and decently so."
The two often travelled together in small towns. He stepped back, letting his gaze travel up toward the church tower. "I wonder, Love, how many tragedies have been tidied into decency since then?" A gust moved through the trees, shaking loose a scatter of wet leaves that landed against the graves with small, papery sighs. From somewhere beyond the wall came the low hum of traffic, subdued by distance. The vicar appeared, umbrella raised, his expression a mix of courtesy and apprehension.
"Inspector, you find nothing sinister, I hope?"
Only curiosity, Reverend. Curiosity is rarely fatal, the vicar smiled weakly. One must hope. It is all rather awkward, you know, it is for the parishioners, I mean. Miss Cramley's death was long ago, and few who recall it speak freely. Can you tell me what you recall? The vicar hesitated. Not first-hand, of course. She was a schoolmistress of sorts, engaged to young Mr. Cramley, the brewer's son. There was talk of a boating accident, though some said she was seen walking near the riverbank later that same day. Confusion of dates, I expect. These things grow distorted. Indeed they do. Purbright's tone was mild, but his eyes lingered on the stone.
And the fiancée?
Married another some years later. His widow still attends service when she's well enough. Mrs. Cramley, Purbright said softly, I believe we should pay our respects. The vicar gave a small, grateful nod, as though the burden of propriety had been gently removed from his shoulders. You'll find her at Briar House on the green. She's not been herself of late. Purbright thanked him and turned toward the path.
Love followed, stepping carefully to avoid puddles.
Seems a lot of fuss over one pumpkin, sir. True, said Purbright, but fuss is often the shadow of fear, and fear, Sergeant, is a very old companion in churchyards. They walked out beneath the dripping yew, the faint echo of their boots striking stone. Briar House stood a short walk from the church, half hidden behind iron railings and a hedge that looked in need of forgiveness. A faint smell of damp roses clung to the air. When the maid admitted them, the hallway was dim and over-furnished, the sort of room that seemed designed to discourage sudden movements. Mrs. Cramley lay upon a chaise near the window, wrapped in a shawl that had once been fine. Her hair, still arranged with meticulous care, was the colour of faded pewter. She received them with the politeness of one used to inspection. Inspector Purbright, he began gently, and my colleague, Sergeant Love, I hope we are not intruding. Not at all, she replied, though her eyes flickered toward the window, where rain traced faint patterns down the glass. I've been expecting some sort of visit. The town always comes calling eventually. Purbright inclined his head. Then perhaps we're only slightly late, she smiled thinly. You hear about that absurd business at the church, I suppose? The pumpkin.
I cannot imagine what possesses people. Nor can I, said Purbright, which is precisely why I must try. He sat opposite her, hat on his knee.
You knew Miss Cramley? There was a pause, no longer than the space between two breaths, yet filled with a tension the air seemed to record. Knew of her? She said. My husband was engaged to her once before the war took its toll on everyone. She drowned, I'm told, so they said. The words came evenly, but her hands moved within the shawl, clasping and unclasping as if they sought an object long lost. A tragic thing. Youth and water seldom mix well. Purbright regarded her for a moment, then said almost kindly, And yet you visit her grave. Her eyes widened just slightly. Who said I did? People notice kindness, Mrs. Cramley, even when it's delivered in secret. She looked away toward the wet garden beyond the glass. People noticed too much. The room fell quiet but for the ticking of a mantel clock. Somewhere above a board creaked as if the house exhaled. At last she said, If someone placed that object there, it wasn't me. I've no fondness for ghosts, Inspector. Purbright rose. No one said you had. But ghosts, in my experience, don't much care for fondness either. They only require acknowledgement. Her gaze followed him as he moved to the door. Do you think she haunts us, Inspector? Purbright paused, his hand on the frame.
No, madam. I think she reminds you. Outside, the drizzle had turned to fine rain.
The street shimmered with reflections of gaslight and puddles. Love walked beside him, silent for a time. Do you believe her, sir? I believe everyone, Sergeant, Purbright replied, lighting his pipe, at least until their honesty becomes inconvenient. He looked back once at the tall, curtained house. That woman's living among gravestones of her own making. As they passed the church again, the bell began to toll for evensong, slow, measured, and resonant. Purbright stopped at the gate, glancing once more toward Edith Cramley's resting place. "Tragically," he said under his breath.
"And decently." The words drifted into the rain like smoke that refused to vanish.
By the following morning, the town had restored its balance, or made a show of it. The fog was gone, replaced by a clear, indifferent sky, and with it came a renewed appetite for tidy reasoning. Nothing unsettled Flaxborough quite like the unexplained, and so the unexplained was briskly folded away. At the municipal offices, the mayor presided over a brief and dignified discussion. His voice, gentle yet firm, echoed faintly against the high plaster ceiling. "A prank, gentlemen. Youthful, tasteless, but harmless. It will not serve us to entertain darker notions. The pumpkin has been removed. The churchyard, I am assured, is once again respectable." Beside him, the churchwarden, Mr. Fenby, nodded with satisfaction. "Quite so, your worship. We've placed the object in the refuse yard. I propose no further fuss be made." A murmur of agreement rippled around the table. Only Purbright, seated quietly at the end, refrained from joining. His hat rested upon his knee, his gaze steady but remote. The look of a man watching a play whose ending he already knew. When the mayor turned to him with benevolent firmness, he said, "You see no reason for alarm, Inspector?" "None at all," Purbright replied smoothly. "Though I'd be obliged if the pumpkin were not yet destroyed." The mayor blinked. "You wish to keep it?" "It for a short time."
"As evidence of sentiment, if nothing else," Mr. Fenby frowned.
"Evidence of mischief, surely, perhaps. But mischief is an art of motive, not of means." The phrase hung there, unwanted but difficult to remove. The mayor cleared his throat. "Very well. Do as you think best, Inspector. But quietly, if you please. The town's nerves are delicate. Flaxborough's nerves," said Purbright mildly, "are its most impressive feature." He left them with polite nods and stepped into the brisk air outside, where the bells of St. Botolph's carried faintly over the rooftops. The streets gleamed from overnight rain, and a few children kicked at puddles with the solemn joy of small conspirators. At the police station, the pumpkin waited in the evidence room, a macabre guest amid files and dust. Its grin, though dulled, remained intact. A faint, musty sweetness filled the air, the scent of decay beginning its quiet work. Sergeant Love looked up from his desk. "You really think there's more to it, sir?" Purbright examined the object, turning it slightly to the light.
"Look at the carving, Love. Not hurried.
Not comic.
There's care here, symmetry, even tenderness."
"Whoever made it wanted to be understood," Love scratched his head. "Understood by whom, though?"
"That," Purbright said, "is what keeps our profession alive." He reached inside the hollow with his gloved hand, withdrawing a scrap of paper curled and damp at the edges.
Love leaned closer as Purbright smoothed it on the desk. The writing, blurred by candle wax, was faint but legible, a single line in an old-fashioned hand. "Remember her kindly." Love exhaled through his teeth. "That's no schoolboy's joke." "No," said Purbright softly. "It's an apology." He folded the paper and slipped it into an envelope. Outside, the afternoon light slanted gold against the blinds, striping the room like an old photograph. Later that day, as the town moved about its comfortable errands, Purbright walked once more through the market square. The air held the scent of roasting chestnuts and wet wood. He greeted passers-by with his usual civility, the postmistress, the bookseller, a pair of schoolboys loitering by the fountain, each returning a polite nod, each faintly relieved that the inspector of police was not asking questions. Flaxborough preferred its mysteries confined to fiction and funerals. He paused near the window of the Citizen, where Mr. Povey had displayed the latest edition. The headline, printed in modest italics, read, "Seasonal Prank in Churchyard, Parish Unruffled." Beneath it, a short column assured readers that the object, believed to be the work of mischievous youths, has been properly removed and disposed of. Purbright smiled faintly and went inside. Povey looked up from his desk. spectacles low on his nose.
"Ah, Inspector."
"You've seen our little reassurance?" "I have."
"A model of discretion." "Quite so," said Povey. "We mustn't feed superstition." "Superstition rarely needs feeding," Purbright replied.
"It thrives best on hunger." The editor blinked, uncertain whether this was agreement.
"Do you think there's any truth in the talk?"
"The old drowning story?"
"I think truth," said Purbright, "is rather like fog."
"The more you wave your arms, the thicker it grows." He left the office to the smell of ink and damp paper. The street beyond was quiet, the town settling once more into its preferred rhythm. But as Purbright crossed the square, he paused by the church railings, gazing toward the dim outline of the yew tree. Somewhere behind those stones, someone had knelt, whispered, and left an offering to memory, not mockery. The neat explanations that soothed the town could not quite reach that place. Love joined him, a packet of sandwiches in hand. "You're not rested then, sir?" Purbright shook his head. "Rest, yes. Close, no." Love followed his gaze toward the churchyard. "Still thinking of her?" "Of whoever still does," Purbright said. "There's a message here, Sergeant, meant for the living. The dead, I find, are usually beyond correspondence." They stood a while longer in silence, the faint wind stirring the leaves at their feet. Somewhere nearby a door slammed, and the distant sound of a piano faltered into tune. Purbright drew on his pipe, the smoke drifting like thought into the cool air. "A neat explanation," he said quietly, "is rather like a tidy grave." "Comforting, but it leaves no room for the truth." He turned away. His steps measured against the cobbles, and the sound of the church bell rose behind him. Slow, deliberate, as if it too refused to let the matter rest. The church smelled of damp stone and polish, that particular fragrance of old wood soaked in centuries of rain and hymns. Purbright stood near the vestry door, where the vicar was coaxing open a long, neglected chest with a ring of keys that clinked like guilty consciences. "It's been here since the last curate's time," the vicar murmured, straining at the lock. "A receptacle for all manner of unclaimed documents, I'm afraid." The hinge gave way with a sigh, releasing a draught of air stale enough to seem exhaled from another age. Inside, bundles of letters, programs, and parish records lay in careful disorder. Purbright drew on his pipe, unlit for the vicar's comfort, and watched the small ritual of rediscovery. "Here we are," the vicar said, producing a yellowed envelope. A note attached to a marriage license that was never used. "Poor Edith Cramley's, as it happens," he handed it over. The paper was thin as onion skin, the ink faded to the grey of old whispers. Purbright unfolded it with the caution of one handling both evidence and emotion. "My dearest Edmund, I cannot bear the stillness of the river. It seems to wait for me. Forgive me if I cannot wait for you." No signature followed. Only a smudge where the nib had faltered, perhaps on a tear, perhaps on hesitation. Purbright read the lines twice, then folded them again with a deliberate precision. "She wrote this before she died?" The vicar nodded. "That's the story, yes. They found it among her things, I believe. The poor man, young Cramley, took it very hard." "Did he?" Purbright asked softly. "Or did he take it very privately?" The vicar looked uncertain. "I couldn't say. His wife would know, of course." Purbright slipped the letter into his coat. "Then I shall ask her." Outside the air was cool, restless with the first stirrings of evening. The church bell sounded 4:30, a dry, almost brittle tone that seemed to measure more than time. At Briar House, Mrs. Cramley received him again, this time with a trace of guarded politeness. The blinds were drawn, though daylight still pressed faintly at the edges, as if the sun itself were unwelcome. "Inspector?" she said, gesturing to the same chair as before. "Still pursuing your horticultural mystery?" "Only the root of it, madam." Her lips twitched, betraying unwilling amusement. "You police do enjoy a pun." "Occasionally," he said, taking his seat. "I came across a letter this afternoon from Miss Edith Cramley. Addressed, I think, to your late husband. She stiffened, though only slightly. He destroyed all that. There was nothing left. Evidently, something remained. He drew the folded page from his coat and laid it upon the table between them. You may recognize the hand. She did not touch it, but her gaze fixed upon the paper with a sort of weary defiance. It proves nothing, Inspector. The girl was unstable, romantic to the point of foolishness. If she chose to end her life, it was her doing, not my husband's, and certainly not mine. I make no accusations, said Purbright gently, only observations, the sort that arise when the dead are remembered in unusual ways. The silence stretched. The clock on the mantel ticked on, unbothered by the living. At length, she said, "Do you think I placed that pumpkin there? That I would defile a churchyard for sentiment? Defile is a strong word. Mrs. Cramley, I should say commemorate. I have nothing to commemorate. Then someone else does." Her eyes lifted to his, a flicker of indignation softening to something like fear. There's no one left who remembers her. Someone does, Purbright said. Enough to kneel by her grave, enough to carve a message in her likeness. I don't suppose your husband ever spoke of such a person?
No. She hesitated, then added, almost against her will, he had
an assistant once.
A girl who worked in the bottling office.
Plain, quiet.
I can't remember her name. Would she have known Edith?
A pause, long enough to be an answer. She might have, she said finally. She came from the same parish. But that was half a century ago, Inspector. She would be an old woman now. Old women, said Purbright, are the most dangerous kind of witnesses. They remember without permission. He rose, and for a moment she seemed to waver between resentment and something almost like relief.
You mean to find her?
If she wishes to be found. At the door, she stopped him with a voice that had turned brittle. If this letter stirs up foolish talk, Inspector, I shall hold you responsible. My husband's reputation is quite safe, Purbright said, turning his hat in his hands. The dead are seldom slandered by the truth. He stepped out into the dusk. The sky hung low and pewter grey, the street lamps flickering to life one by one. A thin mist gathered at the edges of the green, blurring the railings of Briar House into a softened silhouette. Love was waiting by the gate, stamping his feet for warmth. No luck, sir? On the contrary, Purbright replied. We've found our first thread. He passed the letter to the sergeant, who read it under the lamplight. Melancholy sort of thing, isn't it? Melancholy, said Purbright, is often the preface to deceit. They began walking toward the river, their footsteps hollow on the cobbles. From the distance came the slow chime of the quarter hour, and beyond it the whisper of moving water. The air smelled faintly of silt and memory. Funny, Love said after a while.
All this fuss for a pumpkin.
You'd think whoever left it wanted to confess, not frighten. Purbright smiled faintly through his pipe smoke. That's the trouble with confession, Sergeant. It's often mistaken for haunting. They stopped at the bridge, watching the current slide beneath them. Dark, smooth, and tireless. The reflection of the gas lamps trembled on the water, like faces glimpsed, but never fully seen. Purbright spoke quietly, almost to himself. She wrote that the river seemed to wait for her.
Perhaps it still does, Love shifted uneasily.
You think she didn't jump, sir?
I think, said Purbright, that rivers are patient things.
They keep secrets better than people. He turned back toward the town, his figure dissolving into the mist as the bells of St. Botolph's began again. Low, measured, and infinitely restrained, as though marking not time, but remembrance. The following morning broke with a clarity that did the town no favours. Light, cold and impartial, slid along the streets, exposing their thin gloss of civility. Flaxborough looked as ever, respectable enough to reassure itself. But to Purbright, the brightness felt intrusive, like a curtain drawn too suddenly on a half-finished play. He crossed the market square with his usual unhurried gait, nodding to shopkeepers, returning the smiles of those who met his eye and the hasty avoidance of those who did not. The post office clock had just struck 9 when he turned into the church lane, where the scent of wet stone and coal smoke mingled in the air. Inside the vestry, the vicar's assistant, Miss Hanby, was arranging hymn books with the solemn intensity of a penitent arranging her excuses. She started slightly when Purbright entered. "Oh, Inspector, you did give me a turn." "I do that occasionally," he said. "The vicar not about." "In his study, sir."
"I was just tidying up after morning prayers." Purbright regarded her a moment.
She was thin, angular, with eyes that flickered too readily from object to object. The look of someone who had spent a lifetime apologizing to furniture. "You boarded once with the Cramleys?"
"I understand," he said conversationally. Her hands froze on the hymn book. "Oh, only briefly years ago."
"Before the war. They were kind people." "Kindness is a valuable currency," Purbright murmured. "So long as it's not counterfeit," she managed a nervous smile.
"I don't know what you mean, sir." "Nor do I yet." He turned toward the window where the light caught the dust motes in motion.
"You'd remember their home, though?"
"Anything unusual about it?" "Unusual?"
She hesitated. "Only that Mrs. Cramley was very particular. Every photograph turned face forward, every curtain tied just so. She liked order, and Mr. Cramley?" A pause. "He was quieter than one might expect. Polite but not warm. There was a photograph of a young lady in his study before he married, I think. She disappeared one day."
"I asked once, and Mrs. Cramley said it had faded." "Things do," said Purbright softly.
"Colours first, then recollection." He thanked her, left her visibly relieved, and stepped back into the sunlight. As he crossed the yard, the church bell gave a single note, low, solitary, and curiously hollow. At the far wall, the gravedigger, old Phipps, was raking damp leaves into a heap. His movements were slow but deliberate, as though he worked not for the living, but for the rhythm of the soil itself. "Morning, Inspector," Phipps called, leaning on his rake. "Come to see if any pumpkins have sprouted." "Not today," Purbright said with a faint smile.
"Tell me, Phipps, you've been here a long while. Ever notice anything curious about Miss Cramley's grave?"
Phipps scratched his chin. "Can't say as I have, sir, though I remember digging near it once, years back, during the repairs to the church wall. Turned up some odd bits. Buckle, bit of cloth, old coin maybe. Stuff from the war, I reckoned. War relics? Aye, or so I told the vicar. He didn't fancy hearing otherwise." Phipps's eyes narrowed against the sun. "Some of them old graves don't rest easy, sir."
"I'll tell you that for nothing." "Rest," said Purbright quietly,
"is often a matter of negotiation." He walked on, the sound of his footsteps merging with the rustle of leaves and the faint, distant hum of morning commerce. By noon, he found himself in Miss Teatime's shop, a narrow establishment where the air smelled of beeswax, perfume, and faintly scandal. Every object gleamed under her attentive care, from silver spoons to porcelain cherubs. She greeted him with a tilt of amusement. "Inspector, how obliging of you. I was just thinking of you this morning. Always a troubling sign." "I do apologize," Purbright said.
"I seem to haunt good taste." "You do," she said lightly.
"And very politely, too. What brings you into commerce?" "Curiosity," he said. "A dangerous habit, I'm told." "Oh, indeed." She lifted a delicate teacup to the light. "You're thinking of that poor woman again, I suppose? The one with the watery ending?" "Among others." "Well," she said, lowering the cup, "I've known the Cramleys for years. Bought the odd trinket from their attic when the brewery closed. Some fine pieces, though I dare say they sold more memories than furniture." "Did Mrs. Cramley part with them willingly?" Miss Teatime's eyes glinted. "Willingly, Inspector. No woman parts willingly with the symbols of her triumphs. She called it making room for air. I called it evacuation." Purbright smiled faintly.
"And among those trinkets in any letters?"
"Portraits." She thought for a moment. the portraits. There was a little silver locket, though. I opened it, of course, empty. The mark inside read E.C. I assumed it for Edmund Cramley. Her late husband, or Edith, Purbright murmured. The pause that followed was brief, but telling. Ah, said Miss Teatime with a thin, appreciative smile. You see how even initials can misbehave under inquiry. Letters, Purbright said, glancing toward the display case, have a habit of doing so, Miss Teatime, especially when one's conscience writes them. She set down the cup with a faint click.
You mean to stir up quite a storm, don't you, Inspector?
I don't stir, he said mildly. I listen for weather. Outside the wind had risen, a soft, persistent murmur through the alleyways. He left her shop and crossed to the square once more, where the afternoon light had turned the stone facades to the colour of old pewter. The town, in its usual way, pretended not to notice him, yet doors seemed to hush as he passed. A woman at the post-box turned her back too quickly. Two men at the tobacconist's window broke off mid-conversation. In Flaxborough, secrets behaved like drafts. Everyone felt them. No one acknowledged their source. At the station, Love looked up from a report. You've been busy, sir. Hardly, Purbright said, setting down his hat. Just collecting echoes. He took from his pocket the folded letter, the locket, and a note of Miss Hanby's recollection. They lay on the desk like quiet conspirators. Each thread, he said, runs back to the same place. The Cramleys.
And the churchyard? Love frowned.
You think the widow's lying? Not lying, Purbright said. Performing.
There's a difference.
Lies are crude things. Obvious. Clumsy. But performance, Sergeant, is an art form.
And Flaxborough is full of amateur dramatists. He leaned back, watching the smoke coil upward from his pipe.
This isn't about the dead, you see. It's about how the living choose to decorate them. Some with flowers, some with silence. Love turned the locket in his fingers. And some with pumpkins, Purbright smiled. Precisely. From outside drifted the faint clang of a delivery cart, the muffled laughter of a child, and beyond all that the long, low note of the church bell. Steady, unhurried, a reminder that even the most polished of towns was built upon the soft and shifting ground of memory. Purbright glanced toward the window, where the reflection of the bell tower trembled faintly in the pane. Listen carefully, Sergeant, he said. That's the sound of Flaxborough pretending it has nothing left to hide. The morning began brittle and colourless, a thin frost silvering the grass along the churchyard path. The first to notice it was Mr. Hodge, the verger, whose habitual gloom found new cause as he arrived to open the church. There, against the oak of the north door, lay what remained of a pumpkin. Smashed, pulp and skin strewn like an untidy sacrifice. He stared a moment, then sighed, producing his handkerchief as though to mourn privately. Twice, he muttered, is no accident. By the time Purbright arrived, the sun had climbed high enough to cast sharp light through the bare branches of the yew. The smell of bruised fruit hung faintly in the cold air. Much the same size as the last? He asked, kneeling beside the wreckage. Near enough, said Hodge, though this one's got itself more... He hesitated, searching for vocabulary suitable to the clergy. More violence about it. Purbright regarded the mess thoughtfully. Indeed, the first was left whole in silence. This one was left broken, in daylight. He looked up at the heavy door. A different message, I think. Love, who had joined him with a cup of tea gone tepid, shook his head. Same joker, sir. Someone's winding us up, Purbright smiled faintly. Possibly. But the art of provocation requires an audience. Who, I wonder, is meant to take notice this time? He rose, brushing his hands together, and turned toward the interior of the church. The nave was dim and cool, its light filtered through the dusty blue of the stained glass. The air carried the faint scent of candle wax and something older. Wood polish, perhaps, or grief too well kept. He walked slowly along the aisle, his footsteps soft against the worn stone. Near the front pew he paused, looking up toward the chancel where the morning light lay unevenly across the altar. The cracked sound of a pigeon echoed from the rafters. Love followed, whispering despite himself.
You think whoever's doing this means harm, sir?
Harm, said Purbright quietly, comes in many shapes, most of them polite. He stooped to examine the flagstones near the doorway. A faint trail of pulp led inward a few feet, then stopped, as though the object had been flung, not placed. He ran a finger through the residue.
Sticky, he murmured. Sugared, perhaps? Love looked puzzled.
Candied pumpkin, or sweetened for offering, said Purbright, a gesture of appeasement. Someone's conscience, perhaps, rather than their stomach. By late afternoon, the incident had already woven itself into the town's conversation. One half superstition, one half satire. The citizen prepared another brief notice under the headline, "Minor Mischief Continues. Parish Unimpressed." But Flaxborough was impressed, though it pretended otherwise. At the tea room, Mrs. Digby whispered of omens. At the grocer's, it became vengeance. And by dusk, it was simply her. When evensong began, the pews were unusually full. Fear, in Flaxborough, was rarely enough to empty a church. Rather, it made the congregation attend with renewed propriety, as if to be seen doing so might secure immunity. Purbright and Love took places near the back, the inspector's expression calm, almost detached. The vicar's voice rose gently through the nave, his sermon choosing prudence over poetry. The air grew warm from breath and candlelight, carrying the faint rustle of coats and the occasional cough. And then, without warning, came the sound, a soft thud, followed by a murmur of alarm. An elderly woman had sunk sideways against the pew, her hand pressed to her chest. The vicar's voice faltered. Several parishioners turned, uncertain whether to look concerned or continue the hymn. Purbright was already moving. He knelt beside her, his face calm but intent. "Mrs. Greaves, isn't it?" Her eyes fluttered open, clouded with confusion. I
saw her," she whispered. "Whom did you see?"
"The lady by the door." "In the shawl."
"I thought she was Edith." Her breath caught, then settled into a shallow rhythm.
A doctor, summoned by chance attendants, guided her away with quiet efficiency. The congregation, half shocked and half relieved, resumed its hymn with fresh solemnity. Outside, in the cool air beyond the church porch, Love exhaled uneasily. "Coincidence, sir?"
"Must be." Purbright looked toward the shadowed rows of graves.
"Coincidence is the alibi of the unimaginative, Sergeant." He turned toward the light spilling from the church door. "Still, perhaps Mrs. Greaves saw something genuine, though not, I think, spectral. The mind, under guilt or memory, conjures its own witnesses." They walked together through the narrow path between the stones. The mist had gathered again, thin but constant, and the faint tolling of the bell marked the closing of the service. "Funny thing, sir," Love said after a moment.
"If the pumpkins are meant for someone, maybe that old lady was the one meant to see it." "Perhaps," Purbright replied.
Or perhaps she was meant to remember. Back at the station, the letter still lay on Purbright's desk, the one he'd found in the parish chest. He unfolded it again, this time not for the words themselves, but for the space between them. The ink faded in one corner where water had touched it, or a tear. But the edges were oddly trimmed, as if a second page had once accompanied it. He traced the edge with his thumb. "There was more," he said softly. "Something taken away." Love looked up from his notebook. "Missing line, sir?" "Missing confession." Purbright leaned back, the lamplight glinting in his eyes. "Letters tell us as much by what they omit." She spoke of waiting for the river, but not why.
"Not who made her wait?" Love frowned. "You think someone else was involved?"
Purbright smiled faintly. "In Flaxborough, Sergeant, no one ever drowns alone. There's always a witness, even if only in the mirror." He folded the letter again and slipped it into its envelope. Outside, the wind rose softly, brushing the window panes with a restless sound. From far away came the slow, uneven strike of the church bell, still marking the hour. still keeping time for those unwilling to let go. Purbright stood, extinguished the lamp, and spoke half to the darkness, half to himself. The dead are patient, but the living, they start to falter once the truth begins to breathe. In the silence that followed, the faint echo of the river seemed to answer. A quiet, continuous murmur, neither denial nor confession, only the sound of something long concealed, moving again beneath the surface. The wind that night came from the east, thin and persistent, carrying with it the dry rustle of leaves that had outstayed their welcome. In his office, Purbright sat before the dim glow of a single lamp, the surface of his desk cluttered with papers that had ceased to yield surprises. The letter lay at the centre, its ink faint as breath, its meaning sharpened by absence. He studied it, not as a policeman, but as a listener. Each pause, each turn of phrase seemed to belong to a voice both frightened and resigned, one that had expected silence to do its part in the cover-up. Yet silence, he thought, was the most treacherous of accomplices. Love sat opposite, polishing the stem of his pipe without lighting it. "You think there's more to that note than meets the eye, sir?" "There's always more, Sergeant," Purbright said quietly, "especially in matters written for the dead." He leaned back, the chair creaking softly. "Consider it. 2 pumpkins, both left with care. The first, tender, almost devotional. The second, destroyed, as if the penitent had grown impatient with the world's refusal to understand. The rhythm's not vandalism."
"It's confession," Love frowned.
"Confession to what, though?"
"A death from 50 years ago?"
"To guilt that refused to die at all." The clock on the wall ticked, a slow and unhurried sound, more heartbeat than mechanism. Purbright turned the envelope once more, reading the faint impression left by a fountain pen that had pressed too hard. The shape of a single initial appeared against the inner flap. "A. Love," he said. "Who keeps the old parish records now?" "The vicar's assistant, sir. Miss Hamby. She boards, doesn't she?"
"Over the green?"
"That's right. Why?" Purbright smiled without mirth. "Because those who live nearest to the church always hear what it won't say." By morning, the wind had softened. Flaxborough woke to a sky the colour of tin and the smell of distant rain. Purbright and Love took the narrow road towards St. Jude's home, a modest, respectable building that housed the town's elderly, with the decorum of faded furniture. Its garden, once well kept, now leaned toward neglect, but the windows gleamed with that polished, anxious cleanliness unique to institutions of conscience. The matron greeted them with brisk politeness. "You're very welcome, Inspector. We've no trouble here, unless you count the clocks all running slow." Purbright smiled. Time has a way of losing interest in such places. She led them through a corridor lined with framed photographs of better days. Flower shows, choirs, a fete. Faces smiled stiffly from another century. The air smelled faintly of lavender polish and boiled milk. "She's in the east room," said the matron, lowering her voice. "Mrs. Willett, you asked for anyone who worked once for the Cramleys. She was their maid, you know, before the war. Not many left who remember that time." They found her seated by the window, wrapped in a blanket that seemed to have outlasted fashion and comfort alike. Her hands rested neatly in her lap, thin and translucent, but her eyes were alive, small, bright, and unafraid. "Good morning, Mrs. Willett," Purbright began gently. "I'm Inspector Purbright. I'd like to ask you about some old friends of yours." Her mouth curved, not quite into a smile. "Friends? That's a funny word for employers. Perhaps witnesses to the same days would serve better." She chuckled faintly. "Aye, that's nearer the truth." He took a chair opposite her. "You worked for the Cramleys, I believe?" "I did. Cook and general maid. They were respectable, of course?" "Too respectable."
"Everything had to look right. Even grief." "Grief?"
"The girl," she said. "The one who drowned, Edith, came to the house often before it happened. She was engaged to Mr. Cramley, and Mrs. Cramley pretended not to mind. Pretending was her finest skill. Love shifted in his seat, but Purbright remained still. "Tell me what you remember of the day she died." Mrs. Willett's gaze turned toward the window, where the light had begun to fade.
"I remember a storm."
The river was high, the colour of lead. Edith came to the house that afternoon, tearful, wanting to see him. I told her he was out. She said she'd wait by the water, said it was the only place that still listened to her. Her hands, frail but steady, tightened on the blanket. He came home later, clothes wet through, said he'd been walking. But there was mud on his boots, clay from the bank, not the path, and his hands were scratched. He told Mrs. Cramley she was to say nothing to anyone. She didn't, not then. Purbright's voice dropped to a near whisper.
"And later?"
"Later," she said. "The vicar buried Edith and spoke of accident, and Mrs. Cramley ordered a new ring from the jeweller, smaller than the one she'd found in the parlour drawer. The first had Edith's initials inside. The silence that followed seemed to absorb even the ticking of the hall clock beyond the door. "Did you tell anyone?" Purbright asked. "I did once," she said, almost to herself. "To the vicar's wife. She told me confession wasn't my department. Then why now?" She looked at him, her eyes clear and terribly calm.
"Because I can't write any more, Inspector. My hands shake."
"So I carve instead." Love straightened.
"Carve?"
She nodded toward the small table beside her chair. A knife, blunt and harmless-looking, lay beside a half-whittled shape of orange wood, no larger than a candle holder. Its surface bore the beginnings of a grin. Purbright reached out, turning it gently.
"You made the pumpkins?"
"The first two," she said. "My way of saying sorry for saying nothing. Mrs. Greaves saw me last night, poor soul. Thought I was Edith come back. I dropped the second pumpkin. It broke." Purbright replaced the carving carefully on the table. "The apology was heard, Mrs. Willett. You've done what you could." She looked past him, through the window, toward the pale line of the church spire in the distance. "It took me 50 years to learn the difference between silence and peace," she said softly.
"They don't share a bed after all." Purbright rose, his tone gentle.
"No, they rarely do." He left her then, the sound of her slow, careful breathing following him down the corridor. The matron met him at the door. "Did she tell you what you needed to know?" "She told me what she could bear," he said. "The rest will remain between her and the river." Outside, the evening had come fully. The sky was the colour of bruised violets, the air faintly scented with wood smoke. Purbright paused at the gate, looking back toward the dimly lit windows of the home. Love stood beside him, uneasy.
"So that's it then? A guilty conscience 50 years on. Not guilt, Sergeant?" said Purbright quietly.
Atonement. It just took her hands a lifetime to remember what her heart had tried to forget. The wind stirred again, carrying with it the faintest echo of distant bells, each note soft, deliberate, and kind, as though the town itself were offering absolution. The vicarage parlour smelled of damp wool and mild anxiety. A small fire laboured in the grate, giving off more sentiment than warmth, and the sound of rain at the windows provided an oddly polite rhythm to the silence that had settled there. The vicar himself, pale and hesitant, poured tea with the caution of a man handling doctrine. Purbright sat opposite, his hat placed neatly beside him, his manner easy, yet inwardly attentive. The events of the past days had gathered like sediment at the bottom of a long glass. Now, under the vicar's thin light, he intended to stir them gently. "Milk, Inspector?" "A little, thank you." The vicar's hand trembled slightly as he set down the pot. "I must confess," he began, "this entire business has rather unsettled the parish. Mrs. Greaves remains poorly, the congregation anxious. And now this talk of confessions." Purbright smiled mildly. "Confession, Reverend, is often the beginning of peace, though admittedly a troublesome one." The vicar adjusted his spectacles. "You've spoken with Mrs. Willett, I understand?" "I have." Purbright stirred his tea without looking at it. "She's an honest woman, Reverend, honest at least, when the truth finally grew lighter than her guilt. I see.
And she spoke of—
Purbright raised his eyes. Of Edith Cramley.
And of the river.
And of the tidy, convenient lie that half this town built its memory upon. The vicar's face tightened, not in surprise, but in reluctant recognition.
I was only a boy when it happened, Inspector.
But my predecessor told me something of it. He said it was better left untouched. Purbright's voice was calm, almost kind.
Untouched things, Reverend, have a way of rotting beneath the varnish. He leaned back, the firelight softening the sharpness of his features.
It wasn't an accident. Edith Cramley didn't drown because she was melancholy. She drowned because she was frightened. Because 3 respectable people feared her courage more than her despair. The vicar's spoon clinked softly against the cup. 3? Mrs. Cramley, of course. Jealous, though she'd never have called it that. Her husband, whose weakness was the sort that feeds on admiration.
And the 3rd, a friend to them both, a man of standing who considered it his Christian duty to protect their reputations. The vicar said nothing.
But his eyes had grown distant, fixed on the steam rising from the teapot. You knew him, Purbright continued gently.
You probably visited him often in his last years.
The Reverend Chard, I believe his name was then. The vicar closed his eyes briefly, the smallest exhalation escaping him.
He spoke of it once, only once.
He said it had been an accident, that Edith slipped by the bank. They buried her quietly. No inquest, no scandal. The times were different then. Indeed, Purbright said softly. Different times, same excuses. Outside, a gust of wind stirred the rain against the windows, a restless tapping that made the room feel smaller. The vicar sat forward, elbows on knees, his voice barely above a whisper. She was carrying his child, wasn't she? Purbright did not answer at once. He watched the fire, its flicker reflected faintly in the teacup's surface. Mrs. Willett didn't know for certain, but she suspected. So did Mrs. Cramley, I think. That's why Edith came that day, to ask for honesty, perhaps forgiveness. She found only fear. The vicar clasped his hands.
Good Lord. Not good, Reverend.
Merely enduring. Purbright's tone was gentle, but without comfort. The husband struck her.
Once not intending to kill her, but the blow was enough.
The river did the rest. Chard arrived later, found them both half-mad with shock. Between them they made it tidy. A note rewritten, the old letter destroyed, and silence preserved under the blessing of propriety. The clock on the mantel ticked on, precise and indifferent. Mrs. Willett was the only one left who knew, Purbright went on. She stayed silent as instructed. But memory, Reverend. Memory is a tide that keeps returning. This year, on the 50th anniversary, she carved a pumpkin for Edith, an offering of contrition.
And when the town mistook it for mischief, she carved another, angered, ashamed, perhaps wishing someone would understand. The vicar looked stricken. And you intend to pursue this?
Formally?
No. Purbright folded his hands in his lap.
Justice, in the official sense, would be a cruel guest at this late hour. Mrs. Willett's heart won't survive the paperwork.
Nor, I suspect, would the parish's self-esteem. Then what? Purbright smiled faintly.
Then we do what small towns do best, Reverend. We tidy up quietly. We mend the ground, not the story. And in time, the truth will find its own level, as water does. The vicar nodded slowly, his eyes clouded. You'll make no record of it? None that will trouble anyone? He rose, placing his empty cup on the tray. But I suggest you leave Edith Cramley's grave untouched from now on. No flowers removed, no talk suppressed. The living might at least learn silence without deceit. The vicar stood too, frail under the lamplight. You make forgiveness sound so simple, Inspector. Forgiveness rarely is, Purbright replied. But sometimes it's the only thing small enough to fit in a human heart. As he turned to leave, the fire crackled softly, and the smell of damp smoke mingled with the faint aroma of overbrewed tea. He stepped out into the night, the air cool and wet, his boots crunching against gravel. The rain had eased to a fine mist. Across the churchyard, the lamps glimmered through the fog, their light quivering on the stones like breath on glass. He paused at the gate, looking toward the Cramley grave. The grass was slick with dew, the carved letters softened by shadow. Love was waiting there, hands in pockets.
All settled, sir?
In its fashion, Purbright said. Nothing left to arrest but memory. Love glanced toward the grave.
And Mrs. Willett?
She'll rest now, Purbright murmured. She's earned her peace. They stood together, saying nothing more. From the church tower came the slow toll of the hour, spreading through the mist like the closing of a chapter. Purbright lit his pipe, the match flaring briefly against the dark.
You see, Sergeant, he said,
his tone almost reflective. Truth, like tea, must be allowed to cool before anyone can swallow it. The smoke drifted upward, dissolving into the rain-heavy air, while the faint echo of the river murmured beyond the walls. Unending, patient and finally perhaps at rest. By the week's end, the churchyard looked almost itself again. The leaves had been raked into tidy piles, the broken fragments of the second pumpkin discreetly buried beneath the compost heap, and the faint scarring on the door sanded smooth by the verger's dutiful hand. The parish, with its instinct for self-preservation, had resumed its rhythm, its bells, its errands, its mild hypocrisies, as if the disturbance had been no more than a trick of the fog. From the square, St. Botolph's tower rose clean against the pale sky, its stones scrubbed by weather and conscience alike. Only Purbright seemed aware that the air still carried a subtle difference, a hush of unfinished thought. The citizen appeared that Thursday with a blank where speculation might have lived. Mr. Povey, after much editorial restraint, decided to omit the incident entirely. The public, he told his compositor, has had quite enough of unease. What Flaxborough requires is peace. Peace was duly printed, a column on harvest yields, a notice of choir practice, and an advertisement for winter coal. Yet the townsfolk read between the lines as they always did, finding there the echo of something unspoken but mutually understood. Miss Teatime, rearranging the shop window, observed to her assistant that people smile more freely when they've been reminded of their sins. Mrs. Digby, in the tea-room, declared that she had always said forgiveness was the cleanest form of gossip. And the vicar, returning from evensong, confessed privately that the church felt lighter, though he could not say why. Purbright, for his part, took no credit for the change. He simply walked through it pipe in hand, as though through weather of his own making. The town, having flirted with revelation, had drawn its curtains once more, leaving him to the soft satisfaction of quiet outcomes. That afternoon, he strolled through the churchyard with Sergeant Love, who had been persuaded to leave his reports unfinished. The sun hung low, filtering through the last of the yew's tired leaves, and the air smelled faintly of earth, newly turned. "They've done a good job," Love said, nodding at the freshly swept paths. "Looks like nothing ever happened." "That," said Purbright, "is precisely what everyone prefers to see." "Still," Love went on, "you can't help feeling something's changed. Sort of gentler, maybe," Purbright smiled. "Contrition, Sergeant, has a fragrance, faint but noticeable. You'll learn to recognize it." They stopped by Edith Cramley's grave. The inscription, though worn, caught a thin ribbon of light that ran across it like breath. Someone, the vicar perhaps, or Mrs. Willett herself in some final act of habit, had placed a single candle in a glass holder beside the stone. It flickered faintly in the breeze, trembling but unextinguished. Should we leave it there?
Love asked. "Certainly," said Purbright.
Some truths burn better unattended. They lingered a moment longer, the silence between them filled by the soft stir of the trees. From the nave drifted the faint hum of the organ. the vicar, practicing for Sunday. A familiar hymn, one of those gentle English melodies that sound like resignation set to music as they turn to leave. Purbright glanced once more at the grave, then at the line of houses beyond the wall, prim, modest, each holding its secrets beneath clean curtains and painted sills. "You know," he said, "there's a kind of mercy in small towns."
"It's not the forgiving kind, just the forgetting kind."
"But it serves," Love gave a low chuckle. "Suppose that's justice in its Sunday clothes then, indeed, and the world runs on little else." They reached the gate. Purbright paused there, removing his hat briefly, as though in greeting rather than farewell. The wind had shifted, carrying the faint smell of the river through the air. Clean now, almost sweet. He drew on his pipe, exhaled, and watched the smoke drift toward the church spire before it vanished entirely. That evening, in the nursing home on the edge of town, Mrs. Willett dozed by her window, the blanket pulled high around her shoulders. On the table beside her lay the unfinished carving, a final pumpkin, smaller than the rest. The smile upon it was almost tender. When the matron passed, she paused to look, hesitated, then smiled faintly herself, and let it be. In the square, the lamps came on one by one, their light pooling on the cobbles like quiet thoughts. Miss Teatime closed her shutters. The vicar locked his vestry. The church bell marked the hour with a gentleness that seemed to belong to no one in particular. At the station, Purbright sat at his desk, writing the final note for his report. His handwriting was slow, deliberate, the ink spreading faintly at the edges of the paper. No further action required. Matter resolved privately. He set down the pen, looked at the words for a long moment, and then closed the folder. The clock above the door ticked on, patient and contented. He reached for his coat, extinguished the lamp, and stepped into the cool night. Outside, the moon had risen pale over the rooftops, laying a silver glaze upon the quiet town. The air was soft, carrying with it the smell of wet leaves and distant wood smoke. Purbright walked toward the church, his footsteps slow and steady on the cobbles. As he passed the gates once more, the candle still burned by Edith Cramley's grave, a faint, steady point of light against the darkness. He paused only long enough to note it, then touched the brim of his hat and continued homeward, the echo of his steps mingling with the faint murmur of the river. And though Flaxborough had already settled back into its practiced calm, something in its stillness had altered, a gentler order, perhaps beneath the same polite surface, as though for once even the dead had been included in the town's quiet courtesy. By the time Harvest Eve arrived, the town had thoroughly forgiven itself. The church, bright and fragrant with chrysanthemums, welcomed its congregation with the warmth of ritual. Candles flickered along the pews, casting small halos upon bowed heads. The vicar, restored to his composure, spoke of gratitude and renewal, themes that required no apology and promised no trouble. Outside, the evening fog had crept in early, curling through the gravestones and gathering against the windows like a curious spectator. Inside, the organ murmured beneath the voices of the choir, those familiar harmonies that made even unbelief seem briefly respectable. Inspector Purbright sat toward the back, as was his habit, his hat resting neatly beside him. He sang in a low baritone when required, though his mind moved elsewhere. To a river bank, long vanished, to hands carving contrition into orange flesh, to a truth now folded into the earth as tidily as any sermon might wish. The congregation swayed gently with the hymns, their faces softened by candlelight. Mrs. Digby dabbed at her eyes during the prayer for the departed. Mr. Fenby, the churchwarden, glanced discreetly at his watch. Miss Teatime, seated near the aisle, closed her hymn book with a sigh that was half reverence,
half satisfaction, when the final notes faded,
and the vicar's blessing drifted into the still air. The town rose as one, polite, composed, cleansed, by the ritual of good behaviour. The pews emptied with the soft rustle of coats and the muted click of shoes upon stone. Voices returned, tentative at first, then lighter, brighter, already discussing supper, weather, and the price of coal. Purbright remained seated for a moment longer. The candles guttered faintly, their smoke curling upward into the rafters. He watched the flame nearest him bend and recover, as if drawing breath before its quiet extinguishing. Love appeared at his shoulder. "Nice service, sir," he murmured.
"Proper finish to a strange few days," Purbright smiled without looking up.
"Strangeness, Sergeant, is the most reliable part of life. It simply wears better manners in some towns than in others." They stepped outside together into the fog, where the world had shrunk to lamplight and footsteps. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of damp leaves and faint candle wax drifting from the church door. Somewhere beyond the square, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Love tightened his scarf.
"Funny how everyone forgets so fast." "Not forgets," Purbright said.
"Rearranges. It's the local art form." They walked along the path toward the green, the fog deepening with each step, until even the outlines of the houses softened into smudged silhouettes.
A faint glow marked the river's direction, the slow gleam of water reflecting what little moonlight remained. Purbright paused at the bridge.
The surface of the water rippled faintly, disturbed by nothing visible.
"Memory," he said quietly, "is a curious thing, love. It rots more slowly than pumpkins."
"Takes its time. Smells sweeter too until it doesn't." Love gave a small, uncertain laugh.
"You think she's found her peace, sir?"
"Mrs. Willett, I mean." "I think," Purbright replied, "she's finally sleeping without dreams. That's as near to peace as anyone ever gets." They stood a while, listening to the faint murmur of the river moving through the dark. The same patient sound it must have made on the day Edith Cramley vanished. The fog softened it now, turned it from a whisper of guilt into something almost merciful. Eventually Love touched his hat and headed off toward the station, his figure swallowed almost at once by the mist. Purbright watched him go, then turned toward the opposite street, where a few windows still glowed behind curtains. Domestic shapes moved within. Ordinary lives, sealed comfortably against the chill. He resumed his walk, unhurried, the echo of his steps trailing behind him like thought. At the far end of the green, the lamp above Briar House flickered and steadied. Its iron gate, freshly painted, caught a pale glint in the fog. He paused, regarding it with a faint smile. Not mockery, not pity, something gentler. "Order restored," he murmured, "as always." The clock from St. Botolph's tower told the hour. Once, deep and measured, a sound that belonged equally to the living and the dead. It rolled through the mist and faded, leaving only silence and the slow exhalation of the night. Purbright walked on, his silhouette dissolving gradually into the fog. The town behind him settled back into its habitual stillness, the kind earned not through innocence, but through endurance. By morning, the grave would glisten faintly with dew, the candle cold but upright, its flame long gone yet somehow remembered, and Flaxborough, ever courteous, would begin another day, the same and never quite the same. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The end.